You're standing on top of a hill, grass under your feet, sheep grazing nearby, the kind of gentle green mound you'd walk right past without a second glance. Except you're not standing on a hill. You're standing on a 5,000-year-old tomb. And the people who built it did something almost nobody expects. They didn't build it to be seen. They built it to disappear. For most of human history, when people wanted to honor the dead, they built up pyramids that scraped the sky, monuments that dominated the horizon for miles, structures meant to announce, permanently, that someone important once lived and was never going to be forgotten. But scattered across the hills of Britain and Ireland, there's a different kind of monument entirely. Long barrows and passage tombs, some of them older than the pyramids of Giza, built not to stand out from the landscape, but to become part of it. Here's what actually happened. Archaeologists studying these Neolithic tombs found something strange in how many of them were finally closed off. At sites like West Kennet Long Barrow in southern England, after generations of use, the builders didn't just leave the chamber empty or let it fall into ruin. They deliberately filled it. Chalk rubble, broken pottery, and large blocking stones were packed into the passage and burial chambers, sealing them completely, on purpose, as a final act. This wasn't neglect. It wasn't decay. Someone made a decision, gathered materials, and physically closed the tomb from the inside out, ensuring that no one would walk through that passage again. Think about what that means. You spend generations building a structure, using it, returning to it, adding to it. And then, at some point, the people responsible for it choose to seal it shut forever. Not abandon it. Seal it. There's a difference, and the difference tells you something about what these places actually meant. The tomb wasn't just a container for the dead. It behaved more like something with a life cycle of its own. Built, used, and eventually, deliberately, put to rest. This pattern shows up again at one of the most famous megalithic monuments in the world. At Newgrange in Ireland, a passage tomb built around 3,200 BCE, archaeologists uncovered thousands of fist-sized white quartz stones that had fallen away from the front of the mound. For decades, these stones were reassembled into a bright, gleaming white facade. The version most visitors see today, dazzling and impossible to miss. But here's the part that reframes the whole monument. Researchers who re-examined how those quartz stones were found determined they hadn't simply eroded off a finished wall over the centuries. Evidence suggests the quartz facing may have been unstable from very early on, and some archaeologists now argue the stones were more likely part of a ceremonial spread laid out in front of the entrance rather than a wall that clung to the mound's face for millennia. Either way, the tomb's brilliant, unmissable white front, the version that makes it a photograph-perfect monument today, likely didn't last as a highly visible feature for very long at all. Which means, for most of its 5,000-year existence, Newgrange looked nothing like the dazzling white icon in modern photographs. It looked like a grass-covered hill. It had already started returning to the landscape, long before archaeologists arrived to dig it back out. Once you notice this, you start seeing the same intention everywhere across Neolithic Britain and Ireland. Long barrows weren't just built near hills. They were built to resemble hills, long grassy mounds with proportions that echo the natural landforms around them. Some were positioned so their silhouette lines up with the slope of surrounding ridges, blending their outline into the horizon rather than breaking it. Archaeologists studying the wider landscape have noted how easy it would be to walk within a few hundred meters of some of these tombs and never register them as anything but a fold in the land. Even the materials reinforce this blending. Builders often used chalk, turf, and local stone quarried right from the immediate surroundings, so the mound was, quite literally, made from the same ground it sat on. There was no imported marble, no gleaming exotic material meant to stand apart from its setting. The tomb was built from its neighborhood, and it was always going to look, in the end, like it belonged to that neighborhood completely. That's a strange design choice for a monument to the dead. If you wanted to be remembered, wouldn't you want to be seen? Unless being seen was never really the point. Here's the deeper reframe. What if these tombs weren't built as permanent monuments to individual people at all, but as temporary vessels for the community's relationship with its ancestors, a relationship that was expected to change over time and eventually to end. Researchers studying the bones inside these tombs have made a puzzling discovery. Many of the human remains found in the chambers aren't intact skeletons. They're disarticulated, sorted by bone type, sometimes with certain bones like skulls or long bones deliberately arranged in groups, while others are missing altogether. The bodies were not simply placed and left. They were revisited, rearranged, sometimes removed and taken elsewhere entirely. This tells you the tomb wasn't a sealed vault from day one. It was closer to a working space, opened and re-entered over generations as bones were moved, added, and reorganized in ways that mattered to the people doing it, even if the exact meaning is lost to us now. Only at some final point, when that relationship with the space had run its course, was the chamber closed for good. And that final closing wasn't a failure to maintain the monument. It was the monument completing its purpose. A tomb that starts as a threshold between the living and the dead, actively used, actively rearranged, and eventually becomes what it was always going to become, a quiet hill, indistinguishable from the land around it. There's something almost radical in that idea when you sit with it. We tend to assume permanence is the goal of any grand structure, that the whole point of building something enormous out of stone is to make sure it lasts forever, unchanged, instantly recognizable. But the people who built these tombs seem to have been working from a completely different premise. Permanence wasn't the goal. Integration was. The structure was meant to be used, changed, and finally folded back into the earth it came from, the same soil, the same hillside, the same landscape their community walked through every single day. Compare that to how we build memorials now. Marble, bronze, names carved to resist weathering for centuries, specifically engineered against the passage of time. We build to defy erosion. The Neolithic tomb builders, at least based on what's been uncovered at sites like West Kennet and Newgrange, seem to have built with erosion, expecting the monument story to end not in defiant permanence, but in quiet dissolution back into the hillside. Maybe that's the real difference between the pyramid mindset and the long barrow mindset. One says, remember me forever, exactly as I was. The other says, let me become part of the land that outlives all of us anyway. So the next time you're hiking somewhere green and hilly and you pass a mound that looks just a little too round, a little too deliberate to be entirely natural, look again. It might be exactly what it appears to be, a rise in the land. There's more to this story than just Newgrange and West Kennet, though. Once archaeologists started looking for this pattern, deliberate closure followed by gradual reabsorption into the landscape, they began finding it across other Neolithic chambered tombs in Britain and Ireland too. At several chambered cairns excavated in Orkney, off the northern coast of Scotland, researchers found that entrance passages had been carefully blocked with stone at the end of their use, not knocked down by accident, not collapsed by time, but methodically packed shut. In some cases, the facade stones at the entrance were even dismantled and repositioned, as if the builders were undoing their own architecture, stone by stone, on purpose. This raises a question that's easy to miss the first time you hear about these tombs. If the goal was simply to store the dead, why go to all that trouble at the end? Why not just leave the door as it was and let the wind and rain do the rest? The deliberateness of the closing is the detail that keeps pulling archaeologists back to this idea of intentional transformation, not decay by neglect, but decay by design. It also changes how you should picture these places while they were in use. For most of their active life, long barrows and passage tombs weren't hidden monuments at all. They were probably well-known, regularly visited, actively maintained entry points into the earth. Communities likely gathered at them, reopened them, rearranged the bones inside them, added new remains, removed others. The tomb, during this phase, was a living part of a community's relationship with its dead, not a static structure waiting quietly for archaeologists 5,000 years later. It's only after that relationship changed, after the community's need for that specific threshold had run its course, that the sealing happened. And once sealed, the tomb was allowed, maybe even intended, to let the landscape do the rest of the work. Grass grows over disturbed earth. Wind deposits soil into the gaps between stones. Within a few centuries, without any further human intervention needed, a 5,000-year-old stone architecture project looks exactly like every other hill nearby. That's the part that should sit with you the longest. These weren't crude structures that just happened to erode into hillsides because Neolithic building techniques weren't advanced enough to prevent it. The people who built Newgrange also aligned its inner chamber with pinpoint accuracy to the rising sun on the winter solstice, a feat of engineering and astronomical observation that still works exactly as intended more than 5,000 years later. These were not people incapable of building for permanence. They chose for their tombs specifically to build for transformation instead. That choice is what makes the long barrows and passage tombs of Neolithic Britain and Ireland so different from almost every other ancient monument you've probably heard of. The pyramids were built to resist time indefinitely. These tombs were built to work with time, to be actively used for a while, and then to quietly, deliberately come apart into the very land their builders lived on. Or it might be a 5,000-year-old tomb, doing precisely what it was built to do. Not standing as a monument forever, just quietly, patiently, becoming the hill it was always meant to disappear into.